They say the church is a sanctuary, but they never told you what lives beneath it. In 1892, nestled deep within the mist-choked hills of Vermont, a theological institution rose with purpose. Sterling Seminary, a place where young men were trained to preach the word of God, but behind closed doors, they were being conditioned for something else, something ancient, something ruthless. This is not a ghost story. This is a revelation. For over a century, the Sterling Seminary operated like a fortress. No visitors, no records, no alumni. The public only saw the clean, perfect exterior. Oak doors, stone chapels, hymns echoing off marble halls. But beneath the chapel floor, a series of stone corridors stretched into the earth. Unmarked rooms, sealed vaults, ritual chambers built long before the school ever existed. And then, in 1961, everything stopped. No explanation, no investigation. The gates were chained overnight, files were destroyed, whispers silenced. But something survived. What if I told you that Sterling was never a school, but a breeding ground? A program designed not to enlighten, but to erase, to hollow out the souls of its students and remake them into instruments of obedience. You're not watching this by accident. This story has been buried, burned, rewritten, because it holds a truth far too dangerous to be public knowledge, one that links the Sterling Seminary not just to secret societies, but to psychological experiments, blackmail networks, and a hidden elite that feeds on fear, faith, and forgotten men. If you feel something tightening in your chest, good. That means you're waking up. Every man watching this needs to understand, this isn't just about history, it's about programming, control, the architecture of obedience built into our institutions. Sterling was just a prototype, and the same mechanisms they used on boys in black robes, they now use on you. Through your job, your screen, your silence. We're going to dig up what they buried. We're going to trace it back to its origin. And by the end, if you're still here, you won't be the same man. Not because of what you learned, but because of what you'll never be able to unsee. Sterling's official records begin in 1892, but the land it stood on was never innocent. Go back 150 years earlier to 1741. That stretch of Vermont woodland was marked inhospitable by colonial mapmakers. Not because of the terrain, but because local tribes refused to step foot on it. They believed the earth there was cursed, that strange voices whispered through the birch trees, that animals disappeared without a trace, that the ground drank blood too easily. When white settlers finally took that land, the first thing they did wasn't build homes. It was to dig. Reports from early settlers mentioned stone ruins deep underground, not native, not colonial. Older, geometrically impossible, the kind of architecture that bends space just by being there. These ruins were never studied, never photographed, but they were quietly marked on a Jesuit inventory in 1783 alongside other active sites. Then, 100 years later, Sterling Seminary appears, perfectly positioned over the deepest chamber. A coincidence? No. A cover. Here's what they never wanted you to connect. Sterling wasn't founded by priests. It was funded by 3 men, none of them religious, all of them tied to elite banking dynasties with deep Masonic roots. One of them, Lord Edwin Strathmere, publicly claimed the seminary was an offering to the light. That same phrase is etched into the stone altar beneath the chapel, but in Latin and in reverse. You see, Sterling wasn't built to teach God's truth. It was built to test loyalty, to refine obedience, to erase ego and install programming. The boys who entered Sterling never came out the same. Some were brilliant, gifted, others were broken, starved. But by the time they left, if they left, they all shared one thing: silence. Decades later, one former student spoke out, just once. He was 78, near death. In a hospital bed, wired to machines, he read, "We were shown the hole where heaven used to be, and they told us to kneel." He died before the nurse could press the call button. They say history is written by the victors, but that's not true. Real history, the kind that matters, it's erased by the powerful. What if I told you the Sterling Seminary was still active, just not in the way you think? You've been taught to think in categories: school, church, prison, asylum, but Sterling, it was all of them, and none of them. The architecture itself told the story, if you knew how to read it. On the surface, it mirrored old European monasteries, Gothic arches, carved saints, candlelit chapels. But below, the corridors turned in angles that disoriented the senses. No sunlight, no clocks. Every hallway led back to itself eventually, like a loop in the human mind. The builders didn't follow blueprints. They followed rituals. A former stonemason who worked briefly during Sterling's 1912 expansion claimed that construction crews were required to take oaths before entering the sublevels. No one worked 2 days in a row, no one spoke. The materials weren't from Vermont. They came from Italy, Egypt, and somewhere he couldn't identify. He lasted 6 weeks. His final journal entry read, "They're not building for men, they're building for something older." What was this place really? According to a heavily redacted 1938 psychological report, labeled Confidential OSS, Sterling students underwent nightly conditioning sessions beneath the chapel. Some of these included sleep deprivation, others sensory flooding, but the most disturbing were called threshold rites. No one described exactly what they were, but many who went through them developed neurological anomalies. One student, who dropped out after his third rite, reported hearing rhythmic chanting anytime he was near a church bell. He became convinced that Sterling had rewired his brain, that he could only think in patterns they allowed. Others weren't so lucky. We found 4 alumni who were institutionalized within 10 years of graduation. Each one displayed identical symptoms: obsession with sacred geometry, insomnia and mirrorphobia, speaking in dead languages under stress, sketching in posse, architecture compulsively, and always whispering the same 3 words before sedation: God is watching. But they weren't talking about your God. You need to understand, Sterling wasn't abandoned. It was sealed by people who knew what had been awakened in those chambers, by men who feared that the knowledge had gone too far, that the minds they had tried to mold had become vessels for something else. The question isn't what happened at Sterling, it's what escaped. By 1946, Sterling Seminary had fully detached from public oversight. No curriculum was listed, no visitors permitted, mail was intercepted, students arrived under fake names, parents were discouraged from contact, told their sons were entering deep spiritual silence, and for the next 4 years, no one left. Not a single graduation. It was as if the entire student body had been swallowed by the stone. But then came the fire. A classified report buried in decommissioned FBI archives mentions a containment breach at the seminary in February of 1950. Officially, it was called a gas explosion, but photographs taken from reconnaissance planes show something different. Not fire damage, ritual damage. 3 symbols scorched into the north field, burn patterns that match ancient Babylonian sigils, and in the center, a hole, 40 feet wide, blacker than anything natural, no debris, no soil, just absence. They covered it with concrete, built a chapel on top, claimed nothing ever happened. But we found the testimony of a man who was there. His name was Thomas Virelli, a military cryptographer stationed at the nearby base. He intercepted a transmission the night before the event, a scrambled Latin phrase repeated over and over: lux cadit, lux non redibit. The light falls, the light falls, the light will not return. Whatever they summoned, it didn't go away. It went inside. Understand this. Sterling was never about religion. It was about systems of belief. How to fracture a soul, erase its center, and replace it with obedience, not to God, not to country, but to an invisible hierarchy no one could name aloud. The threshold rites, they weren't experiments, they were reforging rituals, designed to crack the ego and rewire perception, to remove the ability to question, to create perfect vessels, not preachers, not prophets, carriers. Carriers of a code, not biological but psychological, ideas that infect, beliefs that blind, and here's the horror most men will never face. Sterling succeeded, not because it lasted, but because its model spread across universities, corporations, political think tanks, media academies. You see their graduates on your screen every day, men with clear voices, sharp suits, empty eyes. You thought you were free because you weren't in chains, but chains aren't always made of iron. Sometimes they're made of belief. To understand Sterling, you must understand what it was preparing for. There's a reason they chose young men, not women, not elders. Specifically males between 13 and 22. A window where the mind is still soft, but the ego begins to crystallize. That age isn't just about education, it's about imprinting. Sterling wasn't training students, it was testing thresholds, how far a mind could be pushed before breaking, and what could be installed in the ashes. Let me make this clear. Sterling Seminary was part of a larger network. An unacknowledged operation embedded inside post-war institutional America, funded by black budget money, protected by religious immunity, and staffed by men fluent in both theology and behavioral science. They studied the rituals of the ancients, not to understand them, but to repurpose them. Egyptian initiation chambers, Sumerian star cults, druidic isolation rites, monastic sensory deprivation. All of it, reassembled, modernized, weaponized. One student wrote in his forbidden journal, later recovered in a demolished dormitory, "They told us that silence is truth, that hunger is purification, that pain was a doorway, and on the third night, when we stopped screaming, we heard the voice beneath the stone." He was 17. He disappeared 2 days later. Why go to such lengths? Why this much investment in a place no one ever heard of? Because the minds they shaped were never meant to live ordinary lives. They were engineered for insertion into governments, intelligence agencies, media, academia. Sterling wasn't a failure, it was a factory. And its graduates, the few who survived intact, weren't victims. They were weapons. Let me ask you something. Have you ever met someone who seemed too calm in chaos? Who made others obey without ever raising their voice? Who could lie with absolute conviction, not because they believed it, but because they belonged to the system that required it? That's a Sterling man. And here's what's worse. They weren't just trained to deceive others. They were trained to deceive themselves. Because a man who no longer remembers his programming will protect it like truth. He'll defend it with his life, and if you question it, he'll call you insane. The deeper you dig into Sterling, the more you realize it wasn't the rituals that broke the boys, it was the silence, structured, enforced, institutional silence. From the moment they arrived, students were stripped of names, identities, even voices. They were assigned numbers. Communication was restricted to approved phrases, often biblical in tone, coded liturgy designed to loop, repeat, fold in on itself. Imagine this. You are 14. You are woken at 3:33 a.m. each night to recite verses you don't understand in languages you don't speak. You are denied sleep for 7 days, then fed sugar water and made to stare into mirrors until your face doesn't look like your own. Then, when you beg for answers, they give you a robe, a name, and a mask, and they call it God's grace. But this wasn't spirituality, this was erasure, a cleansing of the will. And the architects of Sterling, they didn't want thinkers, they wanted reflections, echoes that could be inserted into key structures of society and used to steer thought from within. Because here's a truth they'll never put in history books. Control is never maintained through force. It's maintained through belief, and Sterling mastered the art of manufacturing belief. They created what modern intelligence agencies now call thought mirrors. Individuals who reflect the dominant narrative so perfectly, so automatically, that they become anchors in social systems. It's why, even today, there are senators, media figures, and CEOs who were educated at obscure theological institutions no one remembers existing, Trace their records, they disappear after 1960, but their influence, it's everywhere. And the worst part, many of them genuinely believe they chose this path. Because once you delete memory, insert myth, and seal it with ritual, the subject believes it was his own decision. That's the perfect deception. Let that sink in. They built a system that made men love their own programming, and now those men, or what's left of them, are writing the rules you live under. You see it now, don't you? Sterling Seminary was not a school. It was a blueprint for the world you now inhabit.